In Isaiah chapter 55, verses 8 and 9, God says through the prophet, "My thoughts are not your thoughts. My ways are not your ways. As high as the heavens are above the earth, so are my thoughts above your thoughts." Those verses are right in front of the two verses that we heard in the first reading. And I suspect you've heard that before. God doesn't think like we do. But I wonder if you ever were able to sort of, if you will, wrap your head around it. What does it mean for God to think differently than us? Well, today, you have an example of that in this parable that Jesus tells. I know that many of you, when you hear this parable, you focus on the 4 different kinds of soil, because that's typically how the parable is talked about, and that's all wonderful. But in this case, I'd like to talk about the sower. I want to look at this sower because I think he can tell us something about God and how God thinks. It does help for you to know something about farming in the time of Jesus. They're not entirely sure how everyone farmed in that day and age, but at least some people, it seems, rather than doing what you and I would think, plow the field, get nice furrows, put the seed in the furrows and cover it up, they cleared the field and then literally scattered seed. They'd walk around the field with a bag of seed and they would just throw seed and then later come back and cover that with fresh dirt. And that seems to be what Jesus' character here is doing. He goes out to sow this seed around his field. There are 2 questions about this guy. First, would you hire this sower? Because I wonder if you would. I'm not sure I would. He seems to be rather wasteful. In other words, he's just sowing along, and when he gets to the edge of the field where there might be like a road or a path, he doesn't seem to be very careful to keep the seed in the field. He's just sowing away, and some of it falls on the road. Oh well. And sure, it's hard to know which part of the field might be rocky because rocks might be under the ground, but it would appear that he's not even paying attention. So even if there is a rocky section of his field, he just throws seed there too. And the part that didn't quite get completely cleared up, where there's still weeds, other plants that can grow, it doesn't matter. He just throws seed everywhere. You and I might think that's wasteful. But then that's the second question. You have to ask yourself, why would that even come into our minds? That this guy is wasting the seed that he wants to plant. He's not being very efficient. And the answer to that is because you and I live in a world of scarcity. That is, if you and I were doing this task, we would know that we have like 1 bag of seed. And that's what we have to spread around. And when it's gone, it's gone. And so we're going to want to get the most out of it. But God is not like that. God does not live in a world of scarcity. God lives in a world of abundance, unlimited. Jesus says in his interpretation of this parable, when he's explaining it to the disciples, he says to them, the seed is the word of God. It's what God gives us. You can also think of it as God's love or God's grace. And God does not have a limited amount of love and grace. His word is not limited. So he doesn't look at a group of people, say, and say, well, there's no point in throwing any more grace over there. Those people, they haven't gotten it before. They're never going to get it. I won't bother. And I'm not going to bother to send any grace or love with these people who are all caught up in materialistic, endeavors that are choking out what I throw them. There's just no point. I'll save my love for just these, the good soil. God doesn't do that. And if you think about it, one of the reasons is he doesn't have to. He doesn't have to ration his love. He doesn't have to ration his grace. He's got an unlimited supply of it. He can just give it to everyone. And some of you are sitting here are very grateful that is exactly what God does, because you were at some point some of these soils. You were the ground, the road. God's sending his love and grace to you, and you could not care less. Oh, that's things for old ladies who go to church. That's just what they do. It's got nothing to do with me. But God kept throwing grace and love at you, and look where you are now. Or maybe you were caught up in other things in life, things that were choking your spirituality. And God kept throwing grace, kept encouraging you to get rid of all that other stuff so that you could devote yourself to him, and you managed to do that. So where this leaves us, I think, is in one of three places. You could just, walk out of here and say, that was good. I learned something about God. Because we need to learn more about God and how God thinks and how God works. And so knowing a little bit, just one example of how God thinks differently than we do, is helpful, I think. Because the last thing we want to do is to put onto God our limitedness. We don't want to think that God is like rationing his grace, because he's not. So that might be helpful. For some of you, this just becomes a day of worship and thanksgiving. Because you can think back to a time when indeed you were one, maybe at different times in your life, you were all those soils. And now you have progressed and you're the rich soil. And you can just be grateful. Because, we come to Mass and it's nice to walk away having learned something, but it's also nice just to come to Mass just to worship, to remind ourselves that God does indeed love us, and that is enough. And that we could just be here today to be grateful for all that God has done in our lives. But I will tell you, if you're one of those people, I'm sort of like this, you want to walk away from Mass with something to chew on, something to think about, you might ask yourself, you might look at it this way. Paul tells us that we should put on the mind of Christ. This is a way of basically saying we should learn to think like Jesus. We should learn to think like God. And just encourage you to give some thought. What would it be like if you and I lived our lives, even though we're in a world of scarcity? What if you and I lived our lives as if we were not? Just take your time, the amount of time we have. It's limited. We've got 24 hours in a day, that's it. And so we do our prioritizing of time. But you just wonder what your life's like if you could somehow keep pushing that out of your mind and you lived your life as if you had all the time in the world. So when the kids or the grandkids want to play and you have all this other stuff that's got to get done. It's just got to get done. You've been putting it off, and all these jobs and things like that. But in that moment, if you just I'm going to think like God. I got all the time in the world. Sure, I'd love to play. I mean, we can't get out of the fact that we only have 24 hours in a day. I know that. But I just would commend to you thinking that way, even just sometimes when we can. Those are the ways by which we get to be like God. And when we get to be like God, we get to feel like God, we get to be really happy.